Well, good morning. Good to see you folks this morning. And like I say, I know about Thursday evening, Greg approached me and he said, could you teach the Bible study Sunday morning? And first you sort of hesitate because you say, well, okay, do have enough time to do it? And then you start thinking about your busy schedules and what you have, but you just sort of agree, and then you start thinking about it. You start building up a little anxiety because, oh, well, Greg's not here, and Monty's left, and Wayne Seaton's gone, and probably here it's probably spring break for a few other people. So that, and everybody's sort of tired from our gospel meeting. So am I just going to hear myself talk, or is everybody going to have to help me out a little bit this morning? And so I'm looking for a lot of help. But we're starting to, from what he said, we're picking up in 2 John. Sort of the assignment is to sort of finish up 2 John this morning, get into 3 John, and maybe finish that so that we can start a new study next Sunday morning. I think we left off with 2 John, the very beginning about verse 9. And in our discussion there, we sort of really need to go back to 2 John there and look at the very beginning of that paragraph, because that sort of sets the context of what he's going to be talking about there from 9 to 13, and then the conclusion of the book there itself. He starts out in verse 7, he says, "For many deceivers have gone out into the world." That's sort of a theme that has gone through the New Testament in a lot of places. Paul wrote about it in places. Jesus told about, false teachers going to come ahead. I think Paul wrote to, talk to the Ephesian elders there, talking about even among them would be those that rose up and taught falsehoods and things. So it wasn't something else. But then he goes in and he sort of focuses on a particular false teacher that is there. And because he sort of pauses there with the punctuation. He says, "For many deceivers have gone out in the world." And then and he says, "Those who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh, this is the deceiver and the Antichrist." So he talks and he zeroes in on a particular thing, and this sort of carries on that theme that was discussed there in 1 John about the Gnostic belief and that Jesus didn't come in the flesh, that, he was just a spiritual being, so he couldn't sin, and this thing's here. So, John is writing here, 2 John, and he's really emphasizing this concept there and and then he begins in verse 8, he gives a warning. He says, "Watch yourselves that you do not lose what you have accomplished, but that you may receive a full reward." He's going on, he says, okay, so you have to go back and look at this. What are they supposed to be watching for? Well, they're supposed to be watching for these false teachers and not being led, how do you identify a false teacher? What do we have to do? How can you identify something as false? You have to have something to compare it to, don't you? You need the original. I think one of the things when we look at counterfeiters, the United States, when they have these people that, when they're studying counterfeit bills, they give the original, the proof plates to the people that live. This is what a real $100 bill looks like. And they study every little aspect of that $100 bill. So when they see a fake one presented to themselves, they can start pointing out, well, it's not on the right paper. This typeset is off a little bit. The ink print, it's not the right color. You can start identifying things because you're familiar with the original. And that's a commendation that John is really here telling these people. Watch. Okay? Look. You have to know what the truth is so that you can understand when somebody is deceiving you. How many people like to go down to a used car lot or, and buy a used car? You know, that used car, the guy usually goes in, he polishes it up, he shines it up, you know, he cleans that engine off, you know, he puts the armor all on the tires, you know, he gets it really looking spiffy and clean so that you will overlook, you know, well, there might be some oil in the tailpipe there, back there a little bit. You don't tend to open up the radiator and look at that there's rust floating around in the radiator. You don't go in and you don't take the air cleaner off and look, that air cleaner hasn't been cleaned in a long time. Outside it looks like it's really good. It's, you know, that's really a good car. Got fairly decent tires on it. All the things that you can see, you know, tell you, hey, that's a great car. But starting it, driving it, inspecting some of the things, maybe even, you know, a good mechanic will actually take the spark plug out and put a compression test on each one of those cylinders to see that they're all right. And that's what, you know, John is writing to these people about. Be on the watch. You have to know how to understand and identify a false teacher. And you do that by knowing the truth. So, you know, as we go through there, he says that watch is a warning to us. It says watch, because these deceivers, they're not going to come out and they're just not going to tell you, hey, you know, I'm a false teacher. You know, you don't have to listen to what John has to say. You don't have to listen to what Paul had to say. You don't have to listen to what Peter has to say. Even some of the things they wrote about Christ, you don't have to listen to that. You need to listen to me because I've got a new revelation. And isn't that what some of the religious leaders in the world do today? They tell you, I've got a new revelation. Jesus has spoken to me. And it doesn't matter what he said, this is what. And so where is your responsibility in that? How do you defend against that? How do you approach it? How do you address somebody that says, hey, what the Bible says here isn't, you know, you don't have to pay any attention to that. You have to pay attention to what I'm saying. Do you see where, you know, John is sort of going from here when he gives this warning and he's telling these individuals, watch. It's, you know, you got to be on alert. You got to know what you're looking for. And to know what you're looking for, you have to know what really the truth is. So he goes on, and he begins in verse 9. Anyone who goes too far and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God, and the one who abides in the teaching, he has both the Father and the Son. I think this is sort of where we left off last Sunday. What is he really saying in these verses right here where he's talking, you know, when he's talking about going too far? What's going too far? You know, sometimes we'll go out and we'll see a sign that says bridge out. Can you go too far? What happens? You go too far there, you don't pay attention to the warning that's given. You go over the embankment, you go into the river, you go into the ravine, whatever the case might be. So he's talking something that, so what is he making reference to in going too far?
Adding to the word. It's not in the word, it's not compared to the apostles' teaching. It's something new, something different.
Yeah.
The same warning was in Galatians. You know, Paul warned, was just marveled that they had forgotten the gospel that they had preached and was going off on another.
And what warning did Paul give them there in Galatians? You know, what did he compare it to? He did he does a comparison there in Galatians. What's he say?
He's talking about those who want to pervert the gospel and that they would be accursed, or they should be accursed.
It would be a curse. But he said, even if an angel of God or I myself come and preach something different, isn't that sort of the same thing that John is telling these people that he's writing to here as well? You know, how do you know they're teaching something different?
It's not in the gospel.
Huh? You have to know what the gospel was to begin with. If, you know, we've got our neighbors across here, basically, aren't they saying this, what Paul warned against?
Yeah, I had two young men come to my door and I said, guys, you're out here spreading false doctrine and you're taking the word of a man that says he had seen an angel and you're teaching something completely different than what's written in the New teach that they're teaching another gospel.
Yeah.
They'll even advertise that.
So, so when you look at what Paul said, I mean, shouldn't some red flags start going up? But the situation is, we tend to want to hear something new, don't we? Wasn't that sort of the situation that Paul had when he went to, he comes into Athens and he's there on Mars Hill and he's talking? What did those people want? They want to hear something new.
Itchy ears.
Itchy ears. They just wanted, we'll just listen to it. But why were they listening? Why were they even listening to it? That was just something new. We just sort of want to see what's out there. But Paul went back and he starts going back to foundations and talking. Wasn't that the same situation with the Bereans? What were they commended for? What were the Bereans commended for? Searching the scriptures to see if what Paul was saying doesn't have any validity to it. Is it really is what he's saying, does it have harmony in what God taught? Well, you have to know what God taught, right? So that's why you search the scriptures. You have a foundation to go through, to build upon, How many people, anybody here ever build a house? Gordon builds furniture and things. Does he just have the ideas in his head? Or does he have a pattern or something he always goes back to? Does he just rely on his sight and his knowledge on how much an inch is? What's he use? Use a ruler, don't you? And a ruler that you have confidence in, right? And we all do that. How many people go down here and buy a gallon of gas? Huh? Don't you really want that gallon to be a gallon? We have states that go through and certify. And you want to go through and you ever take time to look at that gas pump? Somewhere on there's a seal by the state of Tennessee that says this gas pump was certified to be correct on such and such a date. That date was 30 years ago. How much confidence can you have on that gas pump pumping a gallon of gas? Not very long. But you want that to be current and up to date. You want it to be certified. Because when it's certified, what do? They come in with a group of instruments. They've got something that measures an exact gallon of gas. They come through, they pump that gas out into that certification. They measure it, and they say, yep, that's a gallon. It's pumping a gallon of gas. There are people that calibrate instruments. They do the same thing. They have a standard to go by, How many people like to go down to the grocery store and, you don't really go to the butcher market anymore to tell them that, but I want 2 pounds of, prime rib. And, the guy measures it, but he's sitting there and he's got his thumb on the scale. All right? Well, the scale could be accurate, but the calibration, the way he's reading it, is not. That's sort of what's going on here, that John's talking about, going beyond what is said. So as we go through and we continue reading there, he's going on, he says, don't let anyone go too far and they don't abide in the teaching of Christ. So you're going too far and you're bringing something else in the teaching of Christ. You've got to know what that standard is. You have to know it. So there's a personal responsibility on each of us to know that. We can't rely on someone else to do it. I've been places before that, somebody's going through and you start talking about something and you hear somebody start, maybe the preacher's not doing something that you agree with and you disagree with him and people get upset. Well, you got to believe what the preacher has to say. Well, do you? Don't you have a responsibility of seeing that what he's saying is in the, abiding in what Christ has to say? And if he's going too far, what do we have? Isn't that why we have elders? That they're supposed to have that responsibility to, uphold the flock of God? You think Gordon and Greg would sit back if we had somebody come in here at our gospel meeting this week and they started teaching something that went beyond the gospel? Do you think they'd just sit there and say, "Oh, okay, we'll let him finish"? Or would would you stand up and say, "Where are you getting this? What's going on?" I think this is what John is going through and writing to these people about. You need to recognize this false teaching. You need to know when somebody's going beyond what's being taught. And then he says, he goes on through there with that, and he says, when you go in this teaching, if you're not teaching this, you don't have God. But the one that does have this teaching has both God the Father. It's sort of a certification. When you have this, you not only have the one, you have the other. Why is John writing there and linking God and Jesus, the Son, there together? Huh? They're both God. And in doing so, what's he saying? They're in harmony with their teaching, right? If you don't believe Jesus' teaching is in harmony with God, can you really have both? Can you have confidence in either one of them?
If we're teaching the same, it's God and the Son, they're one. And we wouldn't know anything other than the work of the Spirit to let us know that what they want us to know. And it's how we have to do it.
So that's why, John writes, a lot of times he makes reference to Paul, he makes reference to Peter. All these apostles taught the same thing, right? How do we know that?
Not only that, there were some who, denied Christ, who denied the resurrection. It wasn't the Sadducees, so that's why another reason he believes in Christ.
Good. I mean, there's things in there that John tells us that, he just goes through there that, this Gnostic belief was, you couldn't have that. Wade, you had something?
Yeah, I was thinking about what you were saying a while ago about going too far teaching. I think that all of us are probably guilty of, as we grow up, we're taught one way. And so when we look at specific scriptures, we look at them in a certain way because that's the way we've always been taught. And that's the way that we have respect for people in our past, and we make decisions like, well, they couldn't be wrong because they're my preacher or my elder or my father or whoever, But I think John not just John, but there's several warnings in the scriptures about going too far. We all have a responsibility to go back to the scriptures and try to make sure that we're teaching and we're actually doing the things that God wants us to do and not relying on somebody else to tell us what to do.
Yeah. And, that's that concept of a pattern. Have you ever, cut out a piece, Gordon, maybe a piece of wood, and you initially take that piece of wood and you use it to mark another piece of wood? Use that same piece of wood. What happens if you take this piece of wood that you have confidence in, you've measured it, you've done everything with it, and you cut it, and then you set it aside, but you take that one that you cut, and then you go over here and you put it on the next piece of wood, and you cut it, and then you set that piece of wood aside, and you come through, and you do that. You get 100 pieces of wood down the road, take that 100th piece of wood, take it back to your original. What do you have? It might be an inch longer than you had, or it might be an inch shorter. You don't know. All right? But going with that original pattern and measuring everything with that original pattern, it's like, that's why we have a ruler. That ruler is set there with that guidance, that you can have your confidence that if you mark 12 inches, it's 12 inches. that you can go here and you can take your, that ruler to something else that makes 12 inches, and you can set it there and it measures. So you have that confidence, always going back to that. And that's what John's talking about, abiding in that teaching, all right? So you have that confidence in that, abiding that. When you go too far, have you really abided in the teaching? You've gone in, you've added something to it, right? Isn't that the warning that's in the book of Revelation? Person that adds or takes away from this book? Is he explicitly talking about the book of Revelation, or is he talking about God's Word? His Word. He's going through and talking about. Isn't that what the Bereans had? They did. They were going back. They had God's Word. They had the Scriptures. They went back. They could look at here's what Paul said. He said this is because of this. Well, we can go back and we can look at the prophecies he's talking about. We can look at what God said, that, what God had promised. And we can make the conclusion that that's what is there. So, I think it's important to see that going back, not going too far and things. Look at what he continues in there. He says, then he goes in and he talks about these people that come in that are false teachers. What's he saying there in verses 10 and following? He says, if anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house, and do not give him a greeting. For the one who gives him a greeting and participates in his evil, the one who gives him a greeting participates in his evil deeds. Is he talking about just having somebody in your home? Or what's he talking about?
You wish him well down the road and hope you get a lot of converts, you're doing wrong.
You're doing wrong, all right? So it's like, going through, how many times did Paul tell, wish people Godspeed? In a lot of his writings and things. Why do you give that commendation, and why is it being refused here?
There's a certain way that's right and there's a certain way that's wrong. And we've got to figure out the right from the wrong. And we've got to make sure that we're admonishing the people that are doing wrong and encouraging the people that are doing right.
Yeah. Okay. Let's look at Priscilla and Aquila and Apollos. Apollos was coming in, and what was he doing?
He didn't have the complete Word of God. He only knew the baptism of John.
Okay. Now, why is what Aquila and Priscilla did approved, and compare it to what's being said here? You thought about that?
He wasn't really a false teacher. He just was not informed. He didn't have the knowledge, the latest word. But he was teaching what he was teaching was true up to a point. But he was lacking the rest of the gospel, I guess you could say.
Okay. And we're going to get into something similar to that over in 2 John a little bit about a particular person that John's writing about. But look at the attitude of Apollos. Was Apollos appalled or taken back or, really discouraged by what Aquila and Priscilla had to say? It was more of an attitude that he had. He wanted to know what was right? He thought he was teaching right, but he didn't have the full teaching. Can we have somebody like Apollos today come in among us? Should we have somebody like Apollos today? Wait.
I think the difference there was because the full revelation hadn't been put out. And so he had received information initially, and then things had changed during this place. There's no change anymore. I mean, the scriptures are all full now. So we all have the complete revelation. At this time, they were still getting some things, and so that's why I think that event occurred.
Yeah, it'd be difficult. Now, somebody comes in and they only had access to maybe Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's the only scripture they had. And that's what they were teaching. All right? But you go through and you start, you hear what they're saying, and well, they're not teaching the full scripture. They're not going beyond that, but they're not teaching. Well, why aren't you teaching this? And you start having a discussion or teaching with you. You take them aside privately, maybe, and you have that lesson with them. And then what happens? Either they're one of two things, right? Maybe three things. One, they're either going, I don't care what you say, I'm going to go do what I want to do anyway. All right? Or two, they might say, okay, well, let me look and let's study a little more and find out. And then they come with an agreement, and then you have a harmonic situation with it. Or he just goes through and he says, he goes down the street and he finds, somebody else, and they start talking to him about the Book of Mormon, and he says, oh, that's pretty good. Maybe, let me start teaching that too. Where do you start and where do you stop? You have that, standard that we're talking about. So, and then but this coming in, when you have somebody come into your house, or it's not just having them over for a common meal, is it? It's participating in a situation like Aquila and Priscilla did with Apollos. And if Apollos didn't, accept the teaching of Christ, do you think Aquila and Priscilla would have sent him on his way to Corinth? No, they wouldn't have done that. Why wouldn't they? Because he wasn't teaching what was revealed. All right? So I think that's important. And then, beginning of verse 12 is sort of a situation, and we look at really 2 John and 3 John. John incorporates this this concept in both of these. He says, there, beginning of verse 12, he says, though I have many things to write to you, I do not want to do so with paper and ink, but I hope to come to you and speak with you face to face, so that your joy may be made full. Why didn't John want to write all these things down and send it to this sister that he's writing to? He sort of tells us, right? The key is sort of in there. He says, I do not want to do so with paper ink, but I hope to come to you because, he says, let's see, I think there in verse 12, he says, sort of the key, he says, though I have many things to write to you about. He had a lot to say to him. We don't use formal letters very much anymore, but when we used to send messages through the post office, if I anticipated going to see you here in a few weeks, all right, and I wanted to talk to you about a particular thing, would I do it so? Would I carry all that out in the letter? Or would I sort of set the framework on what I really wanted to talk to you about later on? If I wrote everything down, why would I need to come and see you? All right? Say you're away at college and you've got, your girlfriend or your fiance home, and you write her a letter and say, I look to be coming home here Thanksgiving, and at that time, there's a lot of things that we need to talk about in our wedding, but I'll talk to you when I get there. All right? Would you sit there? Well, I think in our wedding that, we need to plan our honeymoon, we need to find out how many guests we're going to have going, coming to the wedding. We need to talk, make sure that our parents are on board with everything they want to do. We've got the caterer that we've, done. We've set aside who we want to marry us. You don't go through all that information because there's a lot of personal things and a lot of details that you want to do that sometimes you just can't detail in writing out to someone. So you write this sort of note when you anticipate coming to see somebody because it's a lot easier to talk to somebody face to face and discuss issues and work things out right there, because sometimes in writing, and we really find this with text messages, your text messages when you send to somebody sometimes don't portray that emotion and facial expressions and emphasis. And a lot of times people can mistake what you write on what you mean. And I think John had a lot of things to talk to these Christians about.
John, during the last verse of John, he says there's many other things that Jesus did which are not written one by one. I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written by all of Jesus. John, but he was telling them here in this letter that he's writing now that the things they need to know for salvation.
Yeah. Also, too, a lot of times when you're writing things, you get done, you put that letter in the envelope, and you put it in the mailbox, and the mailman comes to get it. Oh, I forgot that important point. Face to face, a lot of times you have that time to go through and talk about those important points, to discuss them, to go into the detail about them. Here, and I think John is emphasizing that. And then he comes to the very close of the book there, and he says, but he wants to come and see them because he wants to make their joy feel. He wants to come to them on a happy thing, and he wants to relay this message of Christ to them. And in doing so, they can be happy about it, and he can be joyful about it because they've shared in that truth. And then he closes with similar how he opened the book. He says, to the children of your chosen sister greet you. I greet you. So he goes through and he concludes this book with basically how he opens the book and discusses any other things need to be added on 2 John. So we move right away into 3 John. And he starts the book there in John very similar to the way that he started it in 2 John. He says, the elder to the beloved Gaius, whom I've loved in the truth. Beloved, I pray that in all respects you may prosper and be in good health, just as your soul prospers. For I was very glad when brethren came and testified of your truth, that it is, and how you are walking in the truth. I have no greater joy than this, to hear of my children walking in the truth. And it harmonizes very similar to 3 John. Sort of like here, 1 John is a little more detailed. He goes in, he deals with some particular issues, and he's writing, right to the church and to the believers there, talking about false teaching and those that are coming in teaching. And then he goes into 2 John, and he's sort of writing to a sort of an individual select group of people, this beloved lady and her children. And then here in 3 John, he gets it a little closer, and he writes right to a particular individual. How did John look and talk about his relationship with this individual Gaius? How did he address him?
Who he loved.
Huh?
Who he loved.
Loved. He used one particular word, and he uses it about 4 or 5 times in reference to Gaius himself. What was that word?
Truth.
Huh? Well, truth, but a relationship. Beloved. All right? What does that word beloved convey? Break it down.
Thought a lot.
Huh?
He thought a lot of it.
Thought along about it. If we take a look at be loved, right? And you combine them together. That's sort of the concept of that. Is Gaius was someone that he loved personally. Evidently, he had a very, close relationship with Gaius. It wasn't just a casual situation. He knew a lot about him. What were some of the things that he knew about Gaius? Look there in the first 5 verses there. What's he talk about, and what's he wanting there with Gaius? First, he talks about how he has this beloved relationship with him. He says, the elder to the beloved Gaius, who I love in the truth. All right? So that, he sets a foundation where that relationship is. It's in the truth. And he goes through and he builds on that. But then how does he go through and talk about it? He sort of goes into sort of a prayer embedded into the letter, right? He says there in verse 2, he says, Beloved, I pray that in all respect that you may prosper. So he talks about one thing. What did he want?
He wanted him to prosper in spiritual, not prosper physically.
Okay, so we look at this. So he's talking about spiritual things. Then he goes through and the second thing he says, that in all respect you may prosper and be in good health. Is he, how's he referencing that good health? I think 2 aspects, right? Spiritual health and physical health. He wants him to have physical health because what does physical health do for him?
Long life.
Long life. What was Gaius known for? Talking the truth. And so he had a good spiritual health, all right? And then he goes through and says, just as your soul prospers, which he goes back to a spiritual type thing. And then it's for, I was glad when the brethren came and testified of your truth, that is, how you are walking in the truth, and have no greater joy than this, to hear of my children walking in the truth. So, Gaius had a what? You have it. I have it. Matt has it. Wade has it. What do we all have? Huh?
Yeah, there's a relationship with God and a heritage with God.
We have a reputation, don't we? So Paul's talking, John's talking about Gaius' reputation. His reputation was known among the brethren. All right? And the brethren spoke about it. Evidently, there were those that had come in and out from John. John had seen him in various different places. He wasn't just right there with Gaius, but he had heard everything about Gaius from the brethren that had come forth. And there's sort of a introduction of this brethren that he's talking about. He says, and then he goes back and he uses that concept of what was he happy about Gaius? And how did he consider Gaius? Not only was he beloved, but he considered him as what?
It's a child, or his own child that's faithful.
A child of faith. He was encouraged about him walking in the truth, all right? And that's what the relationship. Not only beloved, but he was a child that he was encouraged and had joy about him walking the truth. He says then in verse 5, he says, Beloved, you are acting faithful in whatever you do, in all your accomplishments. For this, the brethren, and especially when they are strangers and they have testified of your love before the church, you will do well to send them on their way and in a manner worthy of God. He's talking about, these brethren, they'd come into Gaius and they could see Gaius' reputation, his speaking of the truth. And how did Gaius send these brethren on? Gordon?
Well, he has, even the visitors or anyone you meet in the community or so, talk very well.
Community. But I think really he's talking about brethren. Could have been, maybe the Apostle Paul came through and saw Gaius. Gaius is sort of a common name. Paul makes reference to a Gaius that he worked with. Maybe there was that situation. But he goes through and he talks about this. But when he talks about brethren, that he sent them on his way, go back to 2 John, he sort of gave, what kind of greeting would he have given them as he was sending them on their way? Not only would he give them the hospitality, taking care of them, but spiritually wise, he was talking about that. And he brings that up and he starts talking about these that had come in and he had sent them away as brethren and wished them well, maybe provided for some of the meats, maybe even helped support their needs in their journey spreading the gospel. All right? And then he says, he brings up another individual. Who does he bring up next there in verse 9? This character. Diotrephes. All right? What do we know about Diotrephes? He a pretty good guy?
To use colloquialism, like he's a little bit too big for his britches.
Too big for his britches. Okay.
He's one of parade, I can't pronounce it. He wanted to be known as first.
Okay. Does that remind you of anything that Jesus talked about? How the Pharisees and the leaders of the Jews, like to be considered in the synagogue. They like to have the seats of preeminence. They like to be, done. They like to be acknowledged for what they had. But, I was reading a number of commentaries, and the biggest thing that they talked about Diotrephes in that was he wasn't very hospitable. Do you think that's what John is writing about, that he wasn't hospitable? And what's it mean to be hospitable?
Think of others better than yourself.
Huh?
You think of others, consider others over yourself.
But the world looks at hospital, he just didn't want to have anybody in his house. He didn't want to entertain people. I don't think that's what John's talking about. He didn't, because the particular people that he wasn't hospitable to were those that were abiding in Christ's teaching, those that were teaching Christ. What did he want to do with them? Or the people that wanted to listen to them? Want to put them out of the church. Sort of reminds you a little bit about, why were people afraid to acknowledge Jesus in their teaching? What were they afraid of? When Jesus was in his ministry, he'd go into a place and teach, and people would turn and follow him, or things. Weren't they afraid that they were going to be put out of the synagogue? Those Diotrephes that were running the synagogues, they didn't want that. And I think this is what, Diotrephes might be one of these individuals that held on to that Gnostic belief. And here he was, in there, and he was sort of controlling things and deciding, okay, you get to stay. Matt, I don't like your teaching. You're trying to follow Christ too much. You got to go. We don't want you here. You're interfering with me trying to, teach that Jesus, didn't come, that he didn't come in the flesh. And so, if you were trying to promote a particular teaching, all right, you don't want to have association with people that are in contrast with you, right? I think that's about it, right? Was that the second bell? We didn't finish. We're close. I think we just have that next passage where he comes in, and he's going to do for next week, we'll sort of look at that, and we'll probably move into our next study. I don't know what that's going to be. Greg might tell us Wednesday night, or somebody might tell us what we're going to do that for the next study. But if not, we'll pick up here about in verse 9 and 10 for next week, and then we just have there to verse 18 to go through and talk about. He talks about another Demetrius, and then he talks about that same passage that he used there in 2 John. All right? Thank you.